Before we begin, subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who thinks the open plains are peaceful. Drop a comment when you finish and tell me if you would have gone down those stairs. Now turn the lights down, put your headphones in, and let me tell you what happened on the Hargrove place, out where the Wyoming High Plains stretch flat and empty in every direction, with nothing to break the wind for miles. Part 1. The Inheritance. My name is Caleb, and this happened to me 2 years ago, when I inherited a piece of land from an uncle I had met maybe 4 times in my entire life. My uncle Ray had lived alone out on the high plains of eastern Wyoming for almost 40 years, working a small cattle operation on land that had been in our family since the 1890s, land so remote that the nearest town, if you could even call it a town, sat almost 45 minutes away by truck. Ray died of a heart attack in the spring, alone, the way he had lived, and it took almost 2 weeks before anyone found him, since he had no close neighbors and no habit of checking in with family. When the lawyer called to tell me the land and the house were mine, I remember feeling mostly confusion, since I had never expressed any interest in ranching and had assumed, if I ever thought about it at all, that the property would simply be sold off to cover his debts. It was not until I drove out there myself, 3 weeks later, to assess the place and decide what to do with it, that I understood there was something else waiting for me on that land besides an old house and a few hundred acres of dry grass. The house itself was unremarkable, a low, single-story ranch house built sometime in the 1950s, showing its age but structurally sound. What caught my attention, walking the property that first afternoon, was a small outbuilding set apart from the house by about 30 yards, a root cellar built into a low rise of earth, its wooden door weathered gray, secured with a heavy padlock that looked considerably newer than everything else on the property. I remember thinking that was strange even then, before anything unusual had happened, before I had any reason to think of that root cellar as anything other than a place my uncle had once stored potatoes and canned goods. A root cellar on a working ranch does not typically need a padlock, let alone one that looked like it had been replaced within the last few years. Part 2. The Neighbor. I spent that first night in the house, planning to stay only long enough to sort through my uncle's belongings and figure out whether to sell the property or lease the grazing rights to someone in the area who actually knew ranching. Around dusk, a truck pulled up the long dirt drive, and an older man climbed out, introducing himself as Walt Denning, who ran cattle on the neighboring section, close to 5 miles away as the crow flies, which out there counted as being practically next door. Walt had known my uncle for over 30 years, and he spoke about Ray with a kind of careful, guarded respect that made me curious even before he said anything specific. We talked for a while on the porch, and eventually, in the way conversations drift when 2 people are circling around something neither one wants to say directly, I asked him about the root cellar and about the padlock. Walt went quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that Ray had started keeping that cellar locked about 6 years earlier, not long after an incident that Walt described only vaguely, choosing his words with obvious care, as a bad spell that Ray went through that summer, something involving nights Ray would not talk about afterward, and a change in him that Walt said never fully went away. I asked Walt directly what he meant by a bad spell. He looked out at the darkening plains for a moment before answering, and then told me something that I did not fully believe at the time, though I would come to believe it fully enough over the following weeks. He said that root cellar had been on that land long before my uncle ever built the house above it, dug sometime in the early homestead days by whoever farmed that section originally, and that there had always been a kind of quiet local understanding, going back generations, that the cellar was best left alone after dark, an understanding nobody could fully explain the origin of anymore, only that it had been passed down the same way you pass down which fields flood in spring and which fence lines need extra reinforcing against the wind. He told me Ray had never taken that old understanding seriously, not for most of his life, treating it as exactly the kind of superstition you would expect old ranching families to carry forward out of habit rather than genuine belief. Until that summer 6 years back, when something happened that changed his mind entirely, and Walt said he had never once, in all the years since, seen my uncle go anywhere near that cellar after the sun went down. Part 3. The Journal. Sorting through my uncle's belongings over the following days, I found a journal tucked into the back of his bedroom closet, water-damaged and clearly old, though the entries that concern me most were all dated within that same summer Walt had mentioned, 6 years before Ray's death. The earlier entries in the journal read like a fairly ordinary rancher's log, notes about cattle, about weather, about the endless small maintenance a place like that requires. Then, in early July of that year, the entries shift abruptly, becoming shorter, more fragmented, and considerably harder to read, both because Ray's handwriting grows visibly less steady and because what he was describing became harder for me to make sense of. One entry reads, and I am reading this as close to word for word as the water damage allows, quote, heard something down in the cellar again tonight. Not rats. Rats do not stop moving the second you go quiet yourself, like they know you are listening for them, end quote. Another entry, a few days later, reads, quote, went down with the lantern to check the shelves, thought maybe something had gotten in and knocked over the preserves. Nothing disturbed. But the dirt floor at the back, past where the shelves end, it was disturbed, like something had been digging from underneath rather than above, end quote. Part 4. The decision to look. I want to be honest with you about something. Reading that journal should have been enough to convince me to simply hire someone to fill that cellar in with concrete and never think about it again, which, looking back, is exactly what I should have done. Instead, I did what I imagine most people confronted with something like this do, which is convince myself that my uncle had simply been an isolated old man whose mind had started playing tricks on him out there alone, and that the responsible, rational thing to do was go see for myself before making any decisions about the property. I want you to understand that I do not consider myself a person who believes easily in things that cannot be explained. I had spent my entire adult life in cities, comfortable with the ordinary, reasonable predictability of modern life. Standing on that porch with my uncle's journal in my hands, I told myself that whatever had happened to him was almost certainly a combination of isolation, grief over my aunt's death a decade earlier, and the kind of slow mental decline that sometimes comes with age and solitude. I went and got the bolt cutters from the equipment shed the following afternoon, while there was still plenty of daylight left, because even in my skepticism, some instinct in me refused to consider going down there after dark. Part 5. What was in the cellar? The padlock came off easily enough, and the wooden door groaned open on hinges that had clearly not moved in some time, releasing a smell of cold earth and something else beneath it, something faintly sour that I could not immediately place. A set of narrow wooden steps led down into darkness, and I clicked on the flashlight I had brought and started down. The cellar itself, at first glance, looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. Wooden shelves lining both walls, mostly empty now except for a few rusted cans and jars whose contents had long since gone unrecognizable. A dirt floor, packed hard from decades of use. Nothing, on that first look, that seemed to justify 6 years of careful avoidance. I made my way to the back of the cellar, past where the shelves ended, the section Ray's journal had specifically mentioned, and it was there that I noticed the dirt floor looked different from the rest, slightly darker, slightly softer, in a roughly circular patch about 4 feet across. I crouched down and pressed my hand against it, and it gave slightly under the pressure in a way that packed earth simply should not, like the ground there had never fully settled the way the rest of the floor had, despite presumably being just as old. I do not know what made me start digging. I want to be honest that it was not bravery, and it was not scientific curiosity either, not really. It was something closer to a compulsion I did not fully understand in the moment, the same kind of pull that makes you press your tongue against a sore tooth even though you know it is going to hurt. I found a small hand trowel on one of the shelves, clearly kept there for exactly this purpose at some point in the cellar's history, and I began clearing away the softer dirt. It came away easily, far too easily for ground that should have been packed by decades of settling, and within a few minutes, my trowel struck something that was not dirt at all. It took me almost 20 more minutes of careful digging to fully understand what I was looking at, and even now, I am not sure understand is entirely the right word for it. Beneath that section of the cellar floor was a second floor, a layer of flat, smooth stones, clearly placed deliberately rather than naturally occurring, fitted together with a precision that felt entirely at odds with the crude, practical construction of the rest of the cellar above it. At the center of that stone floor, roughly where the softest dirt had been concentrated, was a single stone that differed from the others, dark, almost black, with a shallow, worn depression at its center, The kind of wear pattern that usually only comes from something being repeatedly placed there, or repeatedly pressed against it, over a very long span of time. Part 6. The sound. I was still crouched there, staring at that stone, trying to make sense of what I was looking at when I heard it. A sound from directly beneath the stone floor itself, muffled by the layer of rock and earth between us, but unmistakably a voice, and unmistakably, in the way my uncle's journal had described exactly 6 years earlier, my own voice, speaking my own name, in a tone that carried an odd, patient warmth to it, the way you might greet someone you had been waiting a long time to see again. I want to tell you I ran immediately, and eventually I did, but I want to be honest that for several long seconds, I simply knelt there, frozen, listening as that voice continued, low and even, speaking words I could not entirely make out except for my own name, repeated twice more, each time with that same unsettling warmth, like a door being held open for someone who was taking their time deciding whether to walk through it. I would ask you to trust that avoidance completely, dimming for just a moment never before steadying again, that thank you for listening to the whole thing there. And like I this video if it gave you chills, dropping the trowel, share it with someone who has ever inherited a strange old property that I have and moved in my entire life. So you do not miss the next story. I do not remember crossing the 30 yards and tell me whether you would have picked up those bolt cutters. I remember standing at the kitchen window afterward, one of them, staring out at that cellar door standing open in the fading light. Sleep well if you can, and leave whatever is buried right where it is. Part 7. Walt's explanation. I called Walt that same evening, and he came over within the hour. And when I told him what I had found, and what I had heard, he did not seem surprised, only tired, in the way of someone confirming something he had long suspected but hoped never to have to discuss directly. He told me that the local understanding about that cellar, the one he had mentioned so carefully on my first night there, had never really been about the cellar itself. It was about whatever lay beneath it, something the earliest homesteaders in that section of the High Plains had apparently discovered when they first dug down to build a proper cellar for their harvest, something they had chosen, according to the fragments of old local stories Walt had picked up over decades of ranching that land himself, to cover back over rather than disturb any further, and to simply build around ever since. He said the old stories described it, in the vague, careful way such stories tend to survive, as something that had always been there, long before any homesteader arrived, long before, some versions of the story claimed, there had been anyone at all out on that stretch of plains to notice it. Something patient, something that did not seem to want anything urgently, but that seemed, over generations, to occasionally reach out toward whoever lived closest to it, calling to them in exactly the voice most likely to make them want to answer. He told me that as far as he understood it, from what little my uncle had ever been willing to share with him over the years, the safest thing anyone had ever found to do was exactly what the earliest homesteaders had done. Cover it, leave it be, and pass the warning forward to whoever came after, in the hope that each new generation would have the sense to leave well enough alone rather than go looking for an explanation that was never going to bring anyone any comfort once they actually found it. Part. What I chose to do. I hired a contractor within the week, a stranger from outside the immediate area who had no local history with the property and therefore no hesitation about the job, to fill that cellar completely with concrete, floor to ceiling, sealing it permanently. I told him it was to prevent structural collapse, which was not entirely a lie, only an incomplete one. I have not gone back to that property since the concrete crew finished their work. I lease the grazing rights to Walt now, and I have told him, and he has agreed without needing much explanation, that he can do whatever he likes with the house and the land, so long as nobody ever tries to break through that concrete to see what is underneath it. I still hear my own name sometimes, late at night, in that same warm, patient tone, though I have moved twice since selling that property, each time putting more distance between myself and the Wyoming High Plains than the last. I do not know if that means anything is actually still reaching for me, or if it means something about that summer simply lodged itself permanently in my own mind the way a bad dream sometimes does, replaying itself indefinitely long after the actual danger has passed. But I think about my uncle's last journal entry more than I would like to admit, the line about it getting louder after 6 years of near silence, right before he died. And I think, if it really was getting louder for him, quietly, patiently, over all those years he spent alone out there refusing to go anywhere near that cellar after dark, then I am not entirely convinced that filling it with concrete was ever going to be enough to make it stop. If this story does not convince you that some things on this earth were never meant to be dug up, no matter how patient or how quiet they seem once you cover them back over, then I do not think any story will. But I would ask you this. The next time you inherit a piece of land or a house, or anything at all from someone who spent their final years carefully avoiding one specific part of it,